Welcome back, everybody. Today, you guys will be learning about dotted notes. So, on the definition written there, a dotted note is a note with a dot after it, whereas the dot represents half the value of the note. So, we have the underlined words here. These are the key words, half the value, right? And on my previous video, we said that we learned about the semi-brief, the minim, the crotchet, the quaver, and the semi-quaver. Now we said that half of a semi-brief is a minim, half of a minim is a crotchet, half of a crotchet is a quaver, half of a quaver is a semi-quaver. And knowing this, it will help us understand how the dot represents half the value of the note. Now let us make an example. Let us take the semi-brief for instance. If I want to draw a dotted semi-brief, I'll draw it like this, a semi-brief, and therefore I draw a dot. This is how it should be drawn, right? This here is called a dotted semi-brief because it has a dot drawn after the semi-brief. So it's called a dotted semi-brief, right? So now we want to understand, what do they mean when they say the dot represents half the value of the note? So for instance, I said that the semi-brief, let's start with these two notes, the semi-brief and the minim. I said to you guys that half half of a semi-brief is a minim, right? Now here they are talking about value. And when we talk about value, we talk about these beats I've written here: 4 beats, 2 beats, 1 beat, half beat, quarter beat, right? These represents the value of each of these notes. Now we know that the value of a semi-brief is 4 beats, and we know that the value of a minim is 2 beats. Now if we say that half of a semi-brief is a minim, it means that the half the value of the semi-brief is the minim's value. It's equal to the minim's value. So if we say that the value of the semi-brief is 4 beats, meaning half of 4 beats is going to be 2 beats, which is the value of a minim. So basically, which means this dot represents 2 beats. And here we know the semi-brief represents 4 beats. So that is how the dot functions. Remember, to understand this, the dot represents half the value of the note, meaning the dot represents half the value of the semi-brief. And we said if half of a semi-brief is a minim, meaning half of the value of the semi-brief is equal to the value of the minim, meaning half of 4 beats is equal to 2 beats. Now let us move on to other examples so that I will show you how the value of the notes of the dotted notes will also change. Alright, here are the examples of the dotted notes. If you look to your right hand side, we can see that we have a dotted semi-brief, a dotted minim, a dotted crotchet, a dotted quaver, right? And we can see here that each of their values have changed compared to the normal values we have. In the basic notes, semi-brief, minim, crotchet, and quaver, we have here their normal value, which is 4 beats, 2 beats, 1 beat, and half a beat, right? But now, if we have these dotted notes, if we have them as dotted notes, we can see here that their values change. So here we can see that the dotted semi-brief value is now 6 beats, the dotted minim's value is now 3 beats, the dotted crotchet's value is now 1.5 beats, and the dotted quaver's value is now 3/4 beats. Now we want to know how we got to these beats, how they have changed. So now earlier on that since I said that with the dot represents half the value of the note. So meaning here we can see that this dotted semi-brief, the dot represents half the value of the semi-brief, right? And firstly, we know that the semi-brief is 4 beats. Now I told you that since half the value of a semi-brief is a minim, meaning that the half if since I said that half of a semi-brief is a minim, which means that half the value of a semi-brief is equal to the value of a minim, meaning that this dotted note is 2 bits, right? This dotted note will be 2 bits because it represents half the value of the semi-brief. Therefore, the value is 2 bits. This dot also represents the previous note that comes before the original. So here we have a dotted semi-brief, meaning this dotted note represents the previous note or half the value. But for you guys to understand better, I will say it represents the previous note. So meaning the previous note the note that comes before a semi-brief is a minim. So this minim represents the dot here. So basically its value represents the dot. So now how did we get to 6 bits? We know that a normal semi-brief is 4 bits. And since we know that half the value of the semi-brief is equal to the value of the minim, meaning we add these values. So 4 plus 2 equals 6 bits. I hope you guys are understanding that. We said that since half of the semi-brief is a minim, meaning that also the value of the semi-brief is also half the value of the minim. So meaning that half of a semi-brief is half of the value of the semi-brief, which is 4 bits, is gonna be 2 bits. Then that is how we got to these 6 bits. We add these two values, 4 plus 2, which equals to 6 bits. Now let us move on to the minim, the dotted minim. We know that a minim, the value of the minim is 2 bits, right? And we know that half of a minim is a crotchet, meaning that half the value of a minim is equal to the value of a crotchet. So meaning this dot here represents 1 bit because half of it is 1 here, the crotchet is 1 bit. Remember, if you say that half of a minim is a crotchet, which means half the value of the minim is equal to the value of the crotchet. So basically, this dot here represents 1 bit. And we know that the value of a minim is 2 bits. 2 bits. Therefore, we say 2 bits plus 1 bit to equal 3 bits. And that is how we ended up with 3 bits. That is the value of a dotted minim. Now, we move on to a dotted crotchet. We know that a crotchet is 1 bit. And here we know a quiver is half a bit. And we also know that half of a crotchet is a quiver. Meaning that since half of a crotchet is a quiver, meaning that half the value of a crotchet is equal to the value of the quiver. So meaning this dot here, since this dot represents the previous value, it is going to be half a bit, right? And then we know that the original crotchet here is 1 bit. Therefore, we add the bits. 1 bit plus half a bit is equal to 1.5 bits. So therefore, the value of a dotted crotchet is 1.5 bits. And that is how we get to understand that. Then we move on to a quiver, right? A quiver. So a dotted quiver, sorry. So we know that a quiver is half a bit. And half of a quiver is a semi-quiver. Let me draw it here. And we know that a quiver is a quarter beat, right? And I told you guys earlier on that this dot represents half the value of the note. And since we know that half of a quiver is a semi-quiver, meaning that half the value of a quiver is equal to the value of a semi-quiver. So basically, we add both of them. Half plus a quarter is equal to 3 quarter beats. Remember, this dot represents half the value. So half the value of a quiver is equal to the value of a semi-quiver, which is 1/4 beats. And we know that here, a quiver is half a beat. Therefore, we add the two values together to get 3 over 4 beats. So that is how we learn about, that's how we know our dotted notes. Remember that the dot represents half the value or the previous note, the value of the previous note. Therefore, you add the original note, the value of the original note with the value of the previous note to get our values. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned for my next video where I'll be teaching you guys about dotted note equivalents, and I hope you share this video with someone else and you subscribe to my video. Thank you. I'll be seeing you soon. Bye.